Picture this. You are a distinguished Roman senator, one of the most respected men in the empire. Your family name stretches back for generations, your toga bears the purple stripe of nobility, and you've spent decades serving Rome with honor. Tonight, you've received a golden invitation dinner with the emperor himself, an honor that should fill you with pride. But as you climb the marble steps of the Palatine Hill Palace, your stomach churns with dread. The guards at the entrance don't meet your eyes. They know what you're walking into. Their silence speaks volumes. The scent of incense hangs in the air, but it can't quite mask something else: fear. Thick, suffocating. You enter the great hall. Rome's elite are already gathered: senators and their wives, wealthy merchants, hardened military commanders, all standing in uneasy silence. Then you hear it. Footsteps echoing through the corridor, accompanied by manic laughter that makes your blood run cold. Emperor Caligula enters, dressed in silk that shimmers like liquid gold. His eyes burn with a feverish intensity. He surveys the room like a predator studying prey. Then he claps his hands together, his voice booming across the marble walls. "My dear friends, tonight we shall discover who among you truly loves your emperor. Tonight we shall see just how far you're willing to go to prove your loyalty." What follows will shatter every boundary of Roman decency, turning these sacred halls of power into a stage for the emperor's darkest appetites. This is the story of how one man's madness corrupted an empire, how absolute power became absolute corruption. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It's incredible that we can explore these ancient stories together, across time and space, connected by a shared curiosity about the past. To understand how the most powerful man in the world could transform his palace into a den of sexual depravity and psychological torture, to understand Caligula's madness, you first have to understand how he became emperor in the first place. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus in 12 CE, he earned the nickname Caligula, Little Boots. As a child, when he accompanied his father Germanicus on military campaigns, dressed in miniature soldier's gear that charmed the legions, but childhood in the imperial family was anything but innocent. By the time he was 7, Caligula had witnessed his father's mysterious death, possibly from poison ordered by Emperor Tiberius. He watched as his mother Agrippina the Elder and his brothers were exiled, imprisoned, and eventually killed, victims of the ruthless paranoia that defined Roman politics. Imagine being a child, knowing that at any moment, a knock at the door could mean your end. Caligula learned to survive in a world where weakness meant death, and trust was a luxury no one could afford. He became a master of deception, presenting himself as harmless, while his family was systematically destroyed around him. This early trauma would later manifest in his compulsive need to dominate and humiliate others, especially those who reminded him of the power structures that had once terrorized him. When Tiberius finally died in 37 CE, the Roman people welcomed the 24-year-old Caligula with genuine joy. He was the son of their beloved Germanicus, the boy who had once charmed the armies. After decades under Tiberius, a paranoid recluse, Rome longed for a young leader who promised to restore glory, and for 7 months Caligula seemed to be exactly that. He recalled political exiles, he gave generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, he held spectacular games for the people. Rome adored him. But then something changed, something that transformed the imperial palace from a seat of governance into a playground for his darkest desires. In late 37 CE, Caligula fell gravely ill. Ancient sources describe it as a brain fever so severe that the empire itself seemed to stop. For days he hovered between life and death while Rome prayed for their young emperor's recovery. Some historians believe that this illness left him permanently damaged in both mind and spirit. Some historians argue that Caligula's illness caused brain damage. Others believe it simply stripped away the thin veneer of sanity that had been holding his darker impulses in check. When Caligula recovered, those closest to him noticed the change immediately. The young man who had once shown restraint and political wisdom was gone. In his place stood someone who seemed to have lost all connection to reality, all sense of boundaries between the sacred and the profane, between what was acceptable and what was unthinkable. At first, the transformation wasn't obvious to the public. It began with small things: lavish spending, odd behavior in private meetings, increasingly erratic decisions. But behind the closed doors of the imperial palace, a far darker change was taking shape. During his brush with death, Caligula had discovered something intoxicating. As emperor, he could do anything to anyone and no one could stop him. The palace staff were the first to suffer. Servants who had served the imperial family faithfully for years suddenly found themselves subjected to the emperor's bizarre whims and degrading demands. Young male slaves were particularly vulnerable, summoned into his chambers, forced to take part in acts that violated every notion of Roman dignity. But it was the female servants who bore the worst of it. Ancient writers, using the careful language of their time, describe how Caligula prowled the palace corridors at night, choosing women at random to satisfy his appetites. These weren't consensual encounters. They were acts of domination, rituals of power, designed to remind everyone that their bodies, their lives, their very dignity belonged to him. And his hunger wasn't confined to servants. Soon, Caligula began inviting the wives of senators and high-ranking officials to private audiences under the pretense of discussing their husbands' careers or family affairs. These women, raised under the strict moral codes of Roman aristocracy, suddenly found themselves trapped. Refusing the emperor's advances didn't just mean their own death. It meant death for their husbands, their children, their entire families. One particularly chilling account describes Caligula would force these women to strip naked and perform sexual acts while he watched from his throne. Sometimes he brought in multiple women at once, making them compete for his attention. The psychological torture was as calculated as the physical abuse. These proud Roman matrons, women who had once commanded honor throughout the empire, were reduced to mere playthings, props in the emperor's theater of cruelty. What made Caligula's transformation of the palace especially horrifying wasn't just the abuse itself. It was the way he weaponized sex to dismantle Rome's social order. He understood that by forcing the empire's most respected citizens to participate in, or even witness, acts of degradation, he could break their spirits more completely than through any torture. He began hosting elaborate dinner parties that started as refined social gatherings but inevitably spiraled into debauchery. Senators arrived with their wives and daughters, believing they were attending a civilized evening of entertainment. But as the night wore on, the emperor's demands grew darker. Senator Marcus Caligula might say, in the casual tone of a man asking for more wine, "Your wife has such beautiful eyes. I wonder how they would look when she's on her knees before me." The senator could only sit in silence. He knew that any protests meant death, not just for himself, but for his wife, his children, his entire bloodline. Meanwhile, his wife would be compelled to submit to whatever the emperor demanded. Often, while her family looked on in horror, the damage was lasting. Marriages shattered, children scarred, bloodlines that had once defined Roman honor reduced to pawns in Caligula's sadistic game. He took particular pleasure in forcing senators to watch as their wives were degraded. Seating was arranged so that husbands had a clear view, no escape from the humiliation. They watched as the emperor, or his chosen partners, used their wives before their eyes, and the senators' faces betrayed everything: rage, helplessness, and the bitter knowledge that they could do nothing. Helplessness and shame seemed to give Caligula as much satisfaction as the acts themselves. The imperial palace on the Palatine Hill was even remodeled to serve as escalating fantasies. Special chambers were built specifically for group sexual activities, furnished not with normal tables and chairs, but with couches arranged in circles so that every angle of the spectacle could be seen. One chamber, according to ancient accounts, was designed like a miniature amphitheater, with raised seating around a central stage. Here Caligula forced slaves, captured enemies, and even Roman citizens to perform sexual acts, while senators and their families were compelled to watch and applaud. Even his bedroom became a place of terror. Unlike the private quarters of previous emperors, Caligula's chamber was built with viewing galleries and multiple entrances, so he could summon audiences at will. He seemed to delight not only in the acts themselves, but in being watched, turning intimacy into a public display of dominance. Caligula also established what could only be described as a brothel within the palace walls. It staffed the wives and daughters of senators who had fallen out of favor. These women were forced to service not only the emperor but his guests, foreign dignitaries, even common soldiers. It was humiliation elevated to state policy, and Caligula often presided personally, giving orders and commentary like a theater director staging a play. Perhaps most shocking of all was how he wove sexual degradation into the very fabric of Roman religious and political life. Traditions that had been carried out with solemn dignity for centuries, rituals at the heart of Rome's identity, were twisted into opportunities for abuse. During formal Senate meetings, the emperor would sometimes demand, at Caligula's command, senators' wives were sometimes forced to provide sexual services, while their husbands conducted official business. The sacred act of governance became inseparable from humiliation. Rome's most important decisions, made while the empire's most powerful men were compelled to watch their families degraded, religion too was twisted to serve his appetites. Declaring himself divine, Caligula demanded that rituals include sexual acts performed in his honor. Priestesses sworn to chastity were forced into public intercourse, while sacred festivals dissolved into orgies, featuring unwilling members of Rome's noblest families. Even marriage became a weapon. Caligula married and divorced multiple times, sometimes within days. Each wedding was staged not as a union, but as a ritual of humiliation. One chilling account describes him forcing a bride's father to watch as he consummated the marriage in front of the entire wedding party, turning the sacred vows into a public performance of conquest. But Caligula's lust was never just personal indulgence. It became economic terrorism aimed directly at Rome's elites. He would single out the most beautiful wives and daughters of wealthy citizens and demand access to them in exchange for their family's survival. A grotesque marketplace emerged. Nobles were forced to offer their women as payment for political favor or simply to keep what they already had. Families received summons to the palace, knowing full well what awaited their daughters, their wives, their sisters. Refusal meant ruin. Caligula even formalized the system into a kind of taxation. Wealthy households compelled to provide their women for set periods of service, the duration and frequency determined by their financial standing. This was not prostitution in any normal sense. It was sexual slavery, state-imposed, brutal, and inflicted on Rome's most privileged classes. As a demonstration of absolute power, women who resisted Caligula's demands faced horrific punishments. Some were dragged into the arena and forced to perform sexual acts as entertainment during gladiatorial games. Others were sold into brothels, their noble status stripped away, as they were forced to serve as common soldiers and slaves. The message was clear: no one, regardless of birth or status, was beyond the emperor's reach. For the women trapped in Caligula's sexual theater, the impact was devastating. These were women raised under the strict codes of Roman aristocracy, taught that their virtue was their greatest treasure, that their primary duty was to protect their family's honor. To suddenly find themselves reduced to objects of imperial amusement created a psychological trauma that lingered long after the abuse itself. Many were forced to commit acts that violated not only their personal dignity, but also their deepest religious convictions. The dissonance between their upbringing and their forced degradation often drove them to total psychological collapse. Some chose suicide rather than submission. But Caligula anticipated even this. Families of women who took their own lives were punished collectively, sometimes executed, sometimes ruined financially, erasing entire bloodlines in the process. This created a trap with no escape. Women were torn between preserving their personal honor and protecting their families, forced into choices where every path ended in devastation. Caligula seemed to take special pleasure in breaking the strongest spirits. Women who dared to resist were subjected to ever more degrading humiliations until, piece by piece, their will crumbled. When resistance finally gave way to submission, he paraded them as examples, living warnings of what awaited anyone foolish enough to defy him. and perhaps even more shattering than the abuse itself, was the forced complicity of Rome's men. Senators and high-ranking officials were not merely passive witnesses to their wives' and daughters' abuse. They were often required to participate actively in arranging and facilitating these encounters. Caligula would demand that fathers personally deliver their daughters to his chambers, that husbands assist in preparing their wives for sexual encounters, or that brothers help restrain their sisters during group sexual activities. This forced participation created a level of psychological trauma that went beyond simple witnessing. These men became accomplices in their own families' destruction. The emperor understood that by making these men complicit in the sexual abuse of their loved ones, he was destroying their ability to maintain any sense of personal honor or dignity. The senator, who had helped to tie his own wife down for the emperor's pleasure, could never again command the same respect in the Roman Senate. His authority was permanently compromised by his participation in his family's degradation. Some men attempted to resist by refusing to bring their female relatives to palace gatherings, but Caligula had prepared for this as well. Families who failed to comply with sexual demands faced immediate execution, often carried out in public as a warning to others. The choice was simple: participate in your family's sexual abuse or watch them die. One of the most disturbing aspects of Caligula's sexual reign of terror was his inclusion of children in palace activities. While ancient sources are understandably vague about specific details, they make clear that the emperor's sexual appetites extended to minors, both male and female, from Rome's most prominent families. Children who were brought to palace gatherings were forced to witness sexual acts that no child should see, creating psychological trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Some were forced to participate in sexual activities themselves, their innocence destroyed as part of the emperor's campaign to corrupt every aspect of Roman society. The long-term impact on these children was devastating. Many grew up unable to form normal relationships, their understanding of sexuality forever warped by their childhood experiences in the imperial palace. Others became perpetrators themselves, carrying forward the cycle of sexual abuse. As they reached adulthood and positions of power, Caligula seemed to understand that by sexually traumatizing the children of Rome's elite, he was ensuring that his corruption would outlast his own reign. These children would grow up to be the next generation of Roman leaders, but they would carry with them the psychological scars of their experiences in the palace, potentially perpetuating cycles of abuse for decades to come. As his reign progressed, Caligula began to formalize his sexual practices into a kind of religious cult centered around imperial worship. He declared himself a living god and demanded that sexual acts performed in his honor be treated as religious rituals. This wasn't mere megalomania. It was a calculated attempt to legitimize his sexual abuse by cloaking it in religious authority. Temples were established within the palace complex where worshippers were required to engage in sexual acts as demonstrations of devotion to the divine emperor. These weren't voluntary religious practices. They were mandatory sexual performances, required of anyone seeking imperial favor or simply trying to avoid imperial wrath. The emperor created elaborate ceremonies around his sexual activities, complete with formal protocols and ritualistic elements. Sexual intercourse with the emperor or his designated representatives became a form of communion with the divine, while watching these acts became a form of worship required of palace visitors. This religious framework provided Caligula with justification for even his most extreme sexual demands. When senators' wives were forced to engage in group sexual activities, it was presented as a religious obligation rather than mere imperial whim. When children were included in sexual rituals, it was described as initiating them into divine mysteries rather than child abuse. Caligula's sexual terrorism wasn't limited to the palace itself. It extended throughout the empire through a network of officials who carried out similar practices in his name. Provincial governors, military commanders, and other imperial representatives were encouraged to establish their own versions of the emperor's sexual court, creating an empire-wide system of sexual exploitation and abuse. These local officials understood that their continued favor with the emperor depended on their willingness to participate and facilitate sexual abuse. They competed with each other to devise increasingly creative forms of sexual humiliation, sending reports back to Rome, detailing their innovations. In the hope of gaining imperial recognition, the result was an empire where sexual abuse became a standard tool of governance. Local populations lived in constant fear that their wives, daughters, or sons might be selected for sexual service to imperial officials. This created a climate of terror that extended far beyond the palace walls, affecting millions of people throughout the Roman world. Women throughout the empire learned to live with the knowledge that their bodies were not their own, that at any moment they might be claimed by imperial representatives for sexual purposes. This systematic sexual terrorism became one of the defining characteristics of Caligula's reign, leaving psychological scars that would affect Roman society for generations. By 40 CE, Caligula's sexual excesses had reached levels that shocked even those who had witnessed his earlier depravities. Palace gatherings had devolved into elaborate sexual spectacles that could last for days, with hundreds of participants forced to engage in increasingly extreme acts. The emperor's final months were marked by sexual performances of unprecedented scale and cruelty. He would stage massive orgies involving senators, their families, foreign dignitaries, slaves, and even animals, creating sexual tableaux that served as demonstrations of his absolute power over human dignity and morality. These final performances seemed designed not just for personal gratification, but as statements about the nature of imperial power itself. By forcing Rome's most respected citizens to participate in the most degrading sexual acts, Caligula was making a philosophical point about the meaninglessness of traditional Roman values in the face of absolute authority. The breaking point came when Caligula announced his intention to make his sexual practices the official religion of the empire, requiring all Roman citizens to participate in sexual rituals as demonstrations of loyalty. This threat to formalize and universalize his sexual terrorism was what finally convinced the conspiracy against him to act. On January 24, 41 CE, Caligula was assassinated by members of the Praetorian Guard in the underground passages of his own palace. But even in death, the emperor's sexual crimes continued to terrorize their victims. The conspiracy included not just political motivations, but personal ones. Several of the assassins had been forced to watch their own family members subjected to the emperor's sexual abuse. The new emperor, Claudius, faced the enormous task of dealing with the aftermath of Caligula's sexual reign of terror. The physical evidence of the emperor's crimes was extensive rooms equipped for sexual torture, collections of pornographic art depicting real palace victims, detailed records of sexual encounters that served as blackmail material against prominent families. Much of this evidence was quietly destroyed, not out of respect for Caligula's memory, but to protect the victims and their families from further humiliation. Rooms that had been sites of sexual abuse were sealed or completely renovated, as if the new administration was trying to erase the physical memory of what had occurred. The cover-up extended to the historical record as well. While ancient historians clearly documented Caligula's sexual crimes, they used coded language that obscured the full extent of the abuse. Many victims and their families preferred this discretion, understanding that detailed accounts of their experiences would only perpetuate their humiliation. The most tragic aspect of Caligula's sexual terrorism was how effectively it silenced its victims. The Roman social system, with its emphasis on honor and family reputation, made it nearly impossible for survivors to speak openly about their experiences without destroying what remained of their social standing. Women who had been sexually abused by the emperor faced a society that would blame them for their victimization, regardless of the circumstances. Men who had been forced to watch their wives' sexual degradation couldn't speak about their experiences without admitting their own powerlessness and complicity. Children who had witnessed or experienced sexual abuse often carried their trauma in silence. For their entire lives, this conspiracy of silence meant that the full extent of Caligula's sexual crimes may never be known. Families destroyed by sexual abuse had every incentive to hide their experiences, while historical accounts were necessarily limited by social conventions that made explicit discussion of sexual matters inappropriate for public consumption. The silence also meant that many victims never received justice or even acknowledgement of their suffering. The new imperial administration was focused on political stability rather than addressing past abuses, leaving survivors to cope with their trauma. Without support or recognition, the sexual crimes committed in Caligula's palace had consequences that extended far beyond his 4-year reign. The psychological trauma inflicted on Rome's elite created generational patterns of dysfunction that affected Roman society for decades to come. Children who had witnessed or experienced sexual abuse in the palace grew up with profoundly damaged understandings of sexuality, power, and human relationships. Many became perpetrators themselves, unable to distinguish between normal sexual expression and the abusive practices they had learned in childhood. Others became victims again, their childhood trauma making them vulnerable to further exploitation. The families that survived Caligula's reign often found themselves permanently marked by their experiences. Marriages destroyed by forced sexual encounters never recovered, while children raised in environments of sexual terror struggled to form healthy relationships as adults. The social fabric of Roman aristocracy was permanently damaged by the systematic sexual abuse of its most prominent members. Perhaps most significantly, Caligula's sexual terrorism established patterns of imperial abuse that would resurface throughout Roman history. Later emperors, while perhaps not matching Caligula's extremes, when I understood that sexual exploitation was a powerful tool for maintaining control over subordinates and eliminating political opposition today. Tourists walk through the ruins of the Palatine Hill, marveling at the remnants of imperial grandeur, without fully understanding the horrors that once unfolded within these crumbling walls. The marble floors that once echoed with the screams and sobs of unwilling victims now host guided tours and scholarly lectures about ancient Roman architecture. But if you know what to look for, the evidence remains. Foundation stones that once supported rooms designed specifically for sexual torture, drainage systems that carried away the physical evidence of countless assaults, underground passages where terrified victims waited, their turn to be summoned to the emperor's presence. The ghosts of Caligula's victims still haunt these ruins. The senator's wife, who killed herself rather than endure another night of imperial attention. The 10-year-old boy who watched his mother being sexually tortured. The proud Roman matron who was forced to work as a prostitute in the palace brothel. Their stories were deliberately erased from history, but their suffering remains embedded in the very stones of this place. Caligula's transformation of the imperial palace into a theater of sexual horror lasted less than 4 years, but its impact echoed through Roman history and continues to resonate today. The emperor's crimes remind us that sexual abuse has always been a weapon of choice for those who seek to dominate and control others, and that the most elaborate systems of civilization can be corrupted by individuals who recognize no limits on their exercise of power. The palace may be ruined now, but its lessons endure. The systematic sexual abuse of the vulnerable by those in positions of authority isn't a relic of ancient barbarism. It's a pattern that repeats itself whenever human beings are given absolute power over others and choose to use it for evil. The only difference between Caligula's sexual terrorism and modern forms of abuse is the scale and the documentation. the fundamental dynamics of power, control, and sexual exploitation remain disturbingly consistent across the centuries. In the end, the emperor who turned his palace into an orgy left behind more than just traumatized survivors. In political chaos, he created a template for sexual terrorism that would be studied and sometimes emulated by tyrants throughout history. His legacy is written, not in marble monuments or bronze inscriptions, but in the psychological scars passed down through generations of victims, a reminder that the worst crimes are often those that destroy not just bodies but souls.